Colorado proposed a pretty sweeping and expansive broad AI bill in 2024. And it was sort of the first very comprehensive AI law in the United States that would target algorithmic discrimination in high risk decisions. So think about things like housing, credit, healthcare, so on and so forth. The law had been intended to take effect in February of 26, so it's coming up. But not surprisingly, it faced a lot of pushback. And some of the pushback that it faced was that it was too broad. There was ambiguity about what was covered. The language was something like any system that makes a substantial or consequential decision is covered. That, just like we talked about earlier, leaves open a lot of room for interpretation. There was criticism that it was punitive to small businesses because it was applicable to any business more than 50 employees, which is a pretty small business. And the amount of oversight that it requires is costly. And so, if you're thinking about a 60-person organization, they might not have the deep pocketbooks to be able to actually fund a really robust MRM team or sort of ethics team to be able to sort of comply with the law, the sort of all of the brass tacks of the law. And then there was also, just misalignment about sort of whether it went too far. So what happened was all this industry pushback came out. They actually proposed a fix it bill. And there was a big celebration about the fix it bill, high hopes. But this week, what we found out is the fix it bill failed. So the original law is going forward as intended, February 2026. We will not get the fix it bill. Not surprisingly, it failed on all the things that bills fail on. Introduced too late to actually drive alignment, people divided over whether it was too far or not far enough, people on both sides of that coin. And then, of course, good old fashioned politics where there's definitely a feeling of, the people who don't like the bill are the ones that are going to have to comply with it. And maybe they just don't like regulation more generally. So that was what happened.
Interesting.
And it's interesting. I think the reason why this is so important to think about from the policy standpoint is, like I mentioned, Colorado is really the first to enact and pass such a broad law. So the question becomes, are others going to follow? And whether the passing of this law is going to put some pressure on the federal government to come in and sort of preempt the state requirements and say, no, we're going to have a more of a federal approach here as opposed to a state specific patchwork. I think if I'm channeling Sam Altman and thinking about how important it is for the US to be leaders, really hard to be leaders if you have 50 different sets of standards.
For sure.
It's an interesting question. So I expect there to be more debates and lawsuits ahead.
Interesting that you bring up Sam Altman because I think he and some other of the AI leaders were in DC testifying to Congress just this week and kind of total switch of tune. I feel like from, 2 years ago, they're in Congress going, you better regulate this thing before it destroys the whole world. And now they're kind of in DC saying, well, really, we need some light touch regulation so we don't slow us down and lose to China and really maybe you only need to worry about real world experienced harms and not so much on the model. It seemed like a pretty different shift, very counter to what this Colorado law seems to do. But do you have a sense of what's causing that shift? And like what's I mean, is it? I was just noticeable to me that they were like, oh, we've decided that we don't want to be regulated anymore. When they were seemingly oddly 2 years ago going, please come regulate the heck out of us. We need to be protected from ourselves.
Well, I think that one of the comments that Sam used that I really liked is we need sensible regulation that doesn't slow us down. And I think that there's somewhat of a recognition that the risks have changed. And one of the big risks that has changed is now we are in a race with other countries that don't share some of the same sort of democratic ideals that we might share. And so it's important that we have a clear runway to be able to stay ahead. So I think that's one thing that Sam really emphasized in his comments. And I think, he makes a lot of really interesting and good points about. I think the other thing that Sam did not say, or maybe he said and I missed it, but the other reality is I think that there's a lot of like hypothetical and theoretical risks that people talk about, but they're not realized risks yet. So over indexing on sort of preventing things that are not actually problems just doesn't feel like the thing that is really needed. And I think, especially as generative AI has become more mainstream and more people are using it, we're actually seeing how people are using it and how much good it can provide, which I think has surprised everybody. It surprised everybody, the breakthroughs that we're seeing in science and the collaboration and people, having more satisfaction and learning in their jobs and all kinds of things. And so I think that the culmination of just sort of seeing all of the possibilities and realizing that if we overdo the regulatory piece, we might not realize that potential, I think is a new risk that 2 years ago Sam was probably less worried about than he is now.
Well, and maybe give you a little credit as well, because I feel like we from the beginning we're kind of commenting on it. I listened to the list of things that are in the Colorado bill: algorithmic bias in hiring, in housing, in credit. There already are laws banning discrimination in all of these areas that apply to AI technologies, just like they do any other kind of technology used to make decisions. So the question of, do we need new laws about AI specifically, or can we just figure out how to apply the current rules against discrimination to AI technologies doing the same things practically that we've done and that are already there to address real world harms? Seems like maybe a not a bad path, as opposed to passing new AI specific laws focusing on what are we doing in hiring, what are we doing in housing, and how do these laws apply to AI powered technologies.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I think anytime that you have a law that's specifically written around a technology, it's not going to age well, right? So, like, one of the requirements of this law is that you have to disclose to a person every time that there is an AI system in use anywhere. Okay, on its surface, that sounds great. But can you imagine if 20 years ago somebody had written a law that said anytime somebody walks into your business, you have to tell them whether you use the internet?
And
Because
how?
they need to
And
know
every
if you're
time
and how you use the internet. Yeah. And like, that now that sounds ridiculous because we're like, okay, all of us are using the internet all day
constantly.
and we carry it around in a little box that we constantly look at all the time, right? So like that would be insane. And I think there's a couple of laws that are in this vein. Like I'll pick on the e-sign act for a second, where like you have to, disclose certain requirements around like hardware and software requirements to digitally sign something online. And it's like written for a time where like we had printers and like you had to tell somebody if they needed a printer, and, like, the world's changed since then, right? So the fact that we're all trying to chase down and comply with this is somewhat silly, and so I just fear that all of these sort of proposed AI laws are gonna feel like that in probably less than 20 years, because the pace of innovation is a lot faster than it's been in the last 20 years, and so it's not gonna be too far in the future where we look at this law and go, What? This is very silly stuff that we have to do here."
Yeah. So
So
for any regulators out there, take Annie's advice and focus on practical implications in like regulating healthcare and housing and credit. That we already have all sorts of fair lending laws in the credit space that we have found apply really well to AI. And you got to figure out a little bit how it applies, but you don't need a new law, and you don't want to be. I remember the one I dealt with a lot was FERPA, the Federal Educational Right to Privacy Act, and it really had like the sense of like how you're supposed to, what kind of lock you need on the file cabinet that holds a student's records. And when they go digital, you're like, that's not really, it doesn't really translate to the real world the way we're using it. And I gotta be very careful in AI that we're not passing laws that feel like telling me to have a lock and key on the records when, that's not really how we think about it anymore. It kind of feels silly. So I don't know. Good advice for any regulators. I don't know if we have any regulators listening, but if there are legislators, regulators, and he's got some good advice, call her up if you need some advice specific to your case.
yeah, call me up. I have lots of opinions.
Yes, lots of opinions, and some of them even well informed.
Yeah, exactly.